The agronomist had been driving the same stretch of highway through the Oklahoma Panhandle for 31 years, and she knew what the soil was supposed to look like at this time of year. She knew the color of it in spring, when the winter wheat was established and the rains had come and the topsoil was dark and held together in the way that healthy soil holds together. And she knew the color of it in summer when the heat and the wind had been working on it for months, and it was dry, but still coherent, still part of the land rather than part of the air. What she was looking at through the windshield on a Tuesday morning in April was neither of those things. The fields on both sides of the highway were the color of ash, not the dark brown of dry topsoil, not even the pale tan of severely stressed soil. Ash. The color that soil becomes when it has lost its organic matter, when the microbiotic life that holds it together and gives it its depth has been destroyed, when what is left is the mineral fraction stripped of everything that made it agricultural land rather than desert substrate. She had seen soil this color in photographs from the 1930s. She had never seen it in person, not in 31 years of driving this highway and knowing this land. She pulled over. She got out of the car. She crouched down at the edge of the highway and picked up a handful of the soil from the field margin and let it run through her fingers, and the way it ran told her everything she needed to know about its condition. It did not run. It floated. It left her fingers in puffs of fine particles that the light morning wind carried immediately sideways, away from the field, gone before she had finished the motion of opening her hand. The soil had lost its structure entirely. The clay organic aggregates that give healthy topsoil its crumbly, slightly resistant texture, the texture that farmers and agronomists describe with the specific word tilth, the combination of texture and cohesion and biological activity that makes soil capable of supporting crops and retaining water and resisting erosion, were not present. What was running through her fingers was not topsoil. It was something that had been topsoil, and that a specific sequence of conditions had converted into something else, something that the 1930s photographs showed flowing horizontally through the air in walls of darkness that turned day into night across 1,000 miles of the American interior. She stood up. She looked at the field. She looked north and east and west at the other fields visible from the highway, all the same ash color, all the same fine particulate texture, all showing the same characteristic drift patterns where the wind had already begun its work, the small ridges and shadow deposits that marked the movement of soil from where it was rooted to somewhere it is not wanted. She got back in the car. She drove to the county extension office. She told the extension agent what she had seen. The extension agent told her that he had been getting calls about the same conditions from farmers across 3 counties, and that he had put in a request to the state agricultural department for an emergency assessment 2 days ago, and had not yet received a response. He told her that the dryline forecast for the next 10 days showed no significant precipitation. He told her that the wind forecast for the following week showed sustained southwesterlies at 15 to 25 miles per hour, with gusts to 40. She sat in the plastic chair across from his desk for a moment. Then she asked whether anyone had contacted the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service about activating the emergency wind erosion assessment protocol. He said that he had not done that yet. She said that she thought he should do it today. The conditions that are currently developing across a broad swath of the American West, from the southern Great Plains through the Colorado Plateau and into the Intermountain Basin, constitute a convergence of meteorological and ecological factors that atmospheric scientists, soil scientists, and agricultural historians are comparing with the conditions that produced the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The comparison is not made lightly because the Dust Bowl was not simply a drought. It was a specific combination of extreme drought, degraded agricultural practices, and persistent atmospheric circulation patterns that produced one of the most severe ecological and human disasters in American history. A disaster that drove hundreds of thousands of people from their land, destroyed the agricultural economy of a region, and left a landscape that took decades to partially recover. Using the Dust Bowl comparison requires the specific assessment that the current conditions are genuinely similar in the relevant dimensions, not simply that they are severe. The relevant dimensions are 4. The first is the soil moisture deficit, the degree to which the soil has been depleted of its water content below the level at which vegetation can maintain its root structure and the soil microbiology can function. The second is the wind erosion potential, the combination of soil, surface conditions, and wind speed that determines how readily the surface material will be mobilized into the air. The third is the atmospheric circulation pattern that is driving the conditions, and that will determine how long they persist. The fourth is the condition of the soil's protective biological and physical crust, the combination of biological soil crusts, root mats, and surface roughness elements that in intact ecosystems prevents the fine particle erosion that produces the massive dust storms that characterize the most severe wind erosion episodes. The current situation is unusual and potentially alarming in all 4 of these dimensions simultaneously, in a way that has not been documented for the region since the period of the historical Dust Bowl, and it is the simultaneous convergence across all four dimensions that is driving the scientific concern rather than any single factor taken in isolation. The soil moisture deficit across the southern Great Plains and the adjacent regions is at levels that the drought monitoring systems used by the National Drought Mitigation Center and the U.S. Drought Monitor place in the exceptional drought category, the highest severity level in the monitoring classification system, across a geographic extent that is comparable to the spatial scale of the most severe drought periods of the 1930s. The exceptional drought category represents conditions in which crop and pasture losses are widespread and complete, water shortages in reservoirs and aquifers are severe, and the ecological conditions are at the point of irreversible damage to the biological community of the affected area. Conditions at this level have been documented in smaller geographic areas in previous decades, most notably during the 2011 to 2013 drought that affected much of the southern plains. The current conditions are distinguished from those previous episodes by their geographic extent, their depth in the soil profile, and the specific combination of timing and antecedent conditions that have prepared the soil surface for the mobilization that the wind forecast is suggesting will occur. The soil moisture deficit in the current situation reflects a specific multi-year sequence of conditions that has produced a compounding of annual deficits in a way that is mechanistically different from a single severe drought year. The southern Great Plains entered the current period after a sequence of years in which below-average precipitation was compounded by above-average temperatures, producing evapotranspiration demand that exceeded precipitation not just in the driest months, but across essentially the entire growing season for multiple consecutive years. The cumulative effect of this multi-year sequence on the deep soil moisture, the water stored in the soil profile below the depth of the annual precipitation infiltration, has been to progressively drain the reserves that agriculture and native vegetation depend on during the inevitable dry periods between precipitation events. The deep soil moisture is the buffer that allows the Great Plains ecosystem and the agricultural systems built on it to survive the short-term droughts that are a normal feature of the regional climate. Without this buffer, even moderate dry spells produce the kind of surface conditions that the agronomist observed on her morning drive. Because the vegetation that would normally protect the surface from wind erosion cannot sustain itself without the deep water that is no longer there to draw on in dry periods, and the biological soil crusts that provide additional surface protection in non-agricultural land cannot maintain themselves without the moisture that supports the cyanobacteria and lichen that form their living surface. The USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service's assessment of the current soil conditions, which was completed in response to the emergency request and distributed to the relevant agencies, documents topsoil moisture at or near the permanent wilting point across a region of approximately 300,000 square kilometers, meaning that the soil moisture is at or below the level at which plants can extract water from the soil, and therefore at or below the level at which any vegetation can survive. The permanent wilting point threshold is the specific level at which the agricultural context becomes irreversible on short timescales, because crops that have reached wilting point mortality cannot be saved by subsequent rainfall, and the fields will remain bare until they can be reseeded after the next precipitation event that produces adequate germination moisture. Bare fields in a wind-prone environment are the specific physical condition that defines the wind erosion hazard. The topsoil of the Great Plains, developed over thousands of years of prairie grass growth and decay, and the accumulation of organic matter from the biological community of the native grassland, is a fine-textured, light material that is extraordinarily susceptible to wind erosion when it is dry and bare and lacking the cohesion provided by roots and organic matter and moisture. The erodibility of bare, dry Great Plains topsoil under sustained wind conditions was what the 1930s demonstrated with terrible clarity. And the conditions that are currently developing across a comparable geographic area are producing the same susceptibility. The atmospheric circulation pattern that is driving and sustaining the current drought conditions is the dimension of the situation that atmospheric scientists are finding most concerning, because it is not simply a drought circulation pattern. It is a blocking pattern of a specific character that the research community has been studying as one of the manifestations of the jet stream behavior changes that have been occurring in the context of Arctic amplification. And its persistence in the current period is at the upper end of what the historical record documents for blocking events of this type over the American West. The blocking pattern consists of an anomalously strong and persistent high-pressure ridge over the western portion of North America, positioned in a way that is deflecting the storm track that normally delivers precipitation to the Great Plains far to the north and east of its climatological position, leaving the southern plains in a corridor of suppressed precipitation that has been maintained with only brief interruptions for the past 22 months. The ridge has been reinforced repeatedly by the downstream amplification of Rossby waves propagating from the western Pacific. the same physical mechanism that has been identified as contributing to the increased frequency and persistence of blocking events in the western United States in recent years, and that the research on jet stream behavior changes has been connecting to the reduced meridional temperature gradient from Arctic warming. The specific circulation configuration has a historical analog in the atmospheric pattern that characterized the most severe years of the Dust Bowl, when a similar persistent ridge over the western United States suppressed the storm track and produced the multi-year drought that was the essential meteorological context for the ecological and agricultural disaster of the 1930s. The analog is not perfect, as historical circulation analogs never are, but it is close enough in its essential features that the atmospheric historians who study the Dust Bowl and the atmospheric scientists who are analyzing the current pattern are making the same comparison from their respective ends of the research spectrum. The persistence forecast for the current blocking pattern, derived from the ensemble model guidance for the next 30 days, shows a probability distribution that is skewed toward continued persistence rather than rapid breakdown. The majority of ensemble members maintain a ridge configuration over the western United States through at least the next 3 weeks, with only a minority showing the kind of progressive wave pattern that would displace the block and allow the storm track to return to the southern plains. The most pessimistic ensemble members maintain the blocking through 6 weeks or more. The probability-weighted expectation is for the drought conditions to continue and the soil to continue drying through at least the next 3 weeks, with the specific timing and character of any pattern change uncertain beyond that range. 3 more weeks of drying conditions on soil that is already at or near the permanent wilting point across an area of 300,000 square kilometers is not an abstract meteorological projection. It is the difference between the current situation, which is severe but not yet catastrophic in the specific sense of the 1930s comparison, and a situation that could approach the catastrophic threshold in a way that the region has not experienced since the era when the term Dust Bowl entered the American vocabulary. The dust production that the current conditions are beginning to generate is the most visible and most immediately measurable expression of the ecological and meteorological convergence that is developing. The NOAA Air Resources Laboratory, which operates the Hawaii-split dust transport model that tracks the origin and trajectory of dust plumes across North America, has been documenting an increase in dust emission events from the southern Great Plains and adjacent regions that is consistent with the soil surface conditions described by the NRCS assessment. The emission events are not yet at the scale of the 1930s haboobs, the massive dust storms that turned midday skies black and that deposited Great Plains topsoil on the windows of ships in the Atlantic Ocean. But the frequency and the geographic extent of the emission events are increasing, and the specific metrics that the dust production modeling uses to assess whether conditions are approaching the threshold for large-scale dust storm development are showing values that are higher than any period in the satellite-era record of dust emission monitoring. The satellite-era record extends back to approximately 1980 for the dust monitoring products derived from polar orbiting satellite observations, and to the early 2000s for the more comprehensive moderate-resolution imaging spectroradiometer products that provide the highest quality dust detection and characterization. Within this record, the current period is producing aerosol optical depth values, the standard satellite-derived metric for dust loading in the atmospheric column, that are at the high end of what the record contains for this region in this season. The comparison with the 1930s is necessarily indirect, since satellite-era measurements do not extend to the Dust Bowl period, but the historical documentation of that era through surface observations, newspaper accounts, and the oral histories of the people who lived through it provides a qualitative baseline for the comparison that the atmospheric scientists are making. The specific physical threshold that differentiates a severe wind erosion episode from the kind of catastrophic dust storm that the 1930s produced is not a precisely defined single number. It is a combination of emission source characteristics, the area and erodibility of the bare surface material available for mobilization, and the atmospheric transport conditions, the wind speed, turbulence, and atmospheric stability that determine how much of the emitted dust is lofted to altitude where it can be transported long distances rather than redeposited nearby. When the emission source is a large area of highly erodible bare soil, and the atmospheric transport conditions include strong sustained winds with an atmospheric boundary layer structure that promotes vertical mixing of the surface level dust into the upper troposphere, the conditions for the most severe dust events are present. The current situation has an emission source area that is comparable in its geographic extent to the most severe phases of the 1930s dust emission, though the specific characteristics of the soil in the agricultural areas which have been subjected to soil conservation practices that did not exist in the 1930s, including contour plowing, conservation tillage, and windbreak planting, are somewhat more resistant to erosion than the severely degraded soils of the worst Dust Bowl years. This distinction is meaningful but not reassuring, because the soil conservation practices that were implemented in the aftermath of the 1930s were designed and are maintained for the soil conditions and land management practices of the mid-20th century agricultural system. And the combination of the current drought severity, the multi-year soil moisture deficit, and the degree of vegetation mortality that the NRCS assessment documents is producing soil surface conditions that may be approaching the threshold at which the conservation practices are insufficient. The human dimensions of the current situation are visible in the communities of the southern Great Plains in ways that carry specific resonances with the 1930s that the older residents of the region recognize and that the younger residents are encountering for the first time. The farm auctions that have been occurring across the affected counties with increasing frequency as the multi-year drought has pushed operating costs above revenues for an increasing fraction of the region's agricultural operations are a specific echo of the 1930s pattern, when the combination of a drought and economic collapse drove the wave of farm abandonment that produced the Dust Bowl's most visible human legacy, the migration of the Okies and the Arkies documented by Dorothea Lange and John Steinbeck. The comparison between the current farm financial stress and the 1930s agricultural collapse requires some care because the institutional context is different. The agricultural credit and insurance systems that exist today did not exist in the 1930s, and the Federal Crop Insurance Program and the USDA disaster assistance programs provide a financial buffer for affected farmers that was not available to the 1930s generation. These safety nets have prevented the immediate financial collapse that characterized the worst years of the Depression-era agricultural crisis, and have allowed more farmers to continue operating, if at reduced scale, through the current multi-year drought than would have survived a comparable drought in the 1930s. But the safety nets are designed for discrete disaster events, for single bad years, or the occasional multi-year drought that exceeds the statistical frequency that the insurance and assistance programs were calibrated to. They are not designed for the kind of persistent multi-year drought that approaches the duration and severity of the 1930s episode. And the claims experience that the Federal Crop Insurance Program has been accumulating over the current drought period is already producing premium adjustments and coverage limitations that are reducing the effective protection available to the most severely affected farmers. The financial resilience of the agricultural sector in the most affected counties is being eroded by the duration of the current conditions in ways that the safety net was not designed to prevent indefinitely. And the conversations at the farm auctions and at the county extension offices and at the community meetings where farmers are discussing their options reflect a level of existential uncertainty about the future of agriculture in the most severely affected areas that has not been present in the region since the 1930s. The rural communities that depend on agricultural production for their economic base are experiencing the secondary effects of the agricultural stress in the closure of farm supply businesses, the reduction in enrollment at rural schools as families relocate, the declining revenue for county governments that fund services from the property tax base of agricultural land, and the specific social fabric disruption that comes from the departure of families that have been part of a community for multiple generations. These effects are not catastrophic in any single community at this moment, but they are accumulating in ways that threaten the long-term viability of some of the smallest and most isolated communities in the region. Communities that have survived previous drought episodes, but that are facing the current one from a starting position of already diminished population and already reduced economic diversity. The historical context of the Dust Bowl, which the current situation is evoking, and the comparisons being made by atmospheric scientists, soil scientists, agricultural historians, and the farmers and rural community members who are living through the current conditions, is important to engage with honestly, because the comparison does not lead to inevitable catastrophe. The Dust Bowl ended. The Great Plains recovered, partially and slowly, but it recovered. The conservation practices that were implemented in the aftermath of the 1930s reduced the vulnerability of the landscape to subsequent drought episodes, and the subsequent droughts of the 1950s and the 1970s and the early 2000s in the 2011-2013 episode, while severe, did not produce the dust production and the agricultural collapse of the worst Dust Bowl years. The specific reasons why the subsequent droughts did not replicate the 1930s severity include both the changed land management practices and the fortuitous timing of precipitation events that interrupted the drought at critical moments before the soil surface conditions deteriorated to the threshold of massive dust emission. The conservation tillage, the windbreaks, the soil conservation compliance programs attached to federal agricultural support. These practices reduced the erodibility of the agricultural soils compared to the 1930s, But the native grasslands that were the original ecological protection of the Great Plains soils, the root systems and the biological soil crusts in the prairie grass surface cover that prevented wind erosion for thousands of years before the sod was broken, have not been restored. The conservation practices are a significant improvement over the conditions of the worst Dust Bowl years, but they are not equivalent to the native ecosystem's wind erosion protection, and their adequacy under conditions of the severity and duration that the current drought is approaching has not been tested. The specific concern of the soil scientists and the ecological specialists who are most closely monitoring the current situation is not that the conservation practices will fail catastrophically in a single dramatic episode, but that they will be incrementally overwhelmed by the combination of duration and severity that the current conditions are producing, in a way that is not visible in any single week or month of monitoring, but that is cumulative and progressive, and that may not become fully apparent until the surface conditions have deteriorated past the point where the practices can prevent the large-scale dust emission that characterizes the most severe wind erosion episodes. This incremental, progressive character of the current deterioration is one of the reasons that the comparison with the 1930s was not made earlier and is not being made universally now. The 1930s disaster was recognizable in real time as a disaster, with dust storms that were so dramatic and so immediate in their effects that they could not be ignored. And the current deterioration is more gradual, less visually dramatic in its early stages, and more easily rationalized as a severe but ultimately temporary drought episode, rather than as the potential beginning of a comparable ecological collapse. The scientists who are making the comparison are making it not because the current conditions are already as severe as the worst Dust Bowl years, but because the trajectory of the current conditions, if the atmospheric circulation pattern maintains the drought for the additional duration that the ensemble model guidance suggests is possible, would bring the conditions to a level of severity that has not been seen since those years. The water resource implications of the current conditions extend beyond the immediate agricultural domain to the water systems that serve both the agricultural and the non-agricultural populations of the affected region. The Ogallala Aquifer, the vast underground reservoir beneath the Great Plains that has been the primary irrigation water source for the region since the mechanization of groundwater pumping in the mid-20th century, has been declining throughout the current drought period at rates that are substantially above the long-term average depletion rates. The drought has both increased the demand for irrigation water, as dryland crops have failed and farmers have shifted to irrigated production to maintain some agricultural output, and reduced the recharge that comes from infiltration of precipitation that is insufficient to compensate for the increased extraction. The Ogallala's depletion is not a consequence of the current drought alone. It has been depleted steadily since intensive pumping began in the 1950s, and the current drought is accelerating a depletion trajectory that was already problematic before the drought began. But the current acceleration is producing declines in water table depth in some counties that are approaching the level at which pumping becomes economically non-viable because the lift costs exceed the value of the additional water, and the convergence of the current drought with the pre-existing long-term depletion trajectory is creating a specific category of agricultural operation, the irrigated farm in the areas of most severe water table decline, that is simultaneously facing the worst surface moisture conditions in decades and the most restricted access to the groundwater backup that has historically allowed the region's farmers to survive surface droughts. The communities in the affected region that depend on the Ogallala for their municipal water supply face a different but related vulnerability. Several smaller municipalities in the most severely depleted areas have already experienced supply restrictions during the current drought period, and the water management planning that those communities have been conducting has been producing projections of increased restriction risk over the next decade that reflect the combination of the ongoing long-term depletion and the additional stress from the current drought. For some small communities in the southern high plains, the projections are producing the specific and alarming conclusion that the municipal water supply may become insufficient within the next decade without either substantial reduction in consumption or the development of alternative water sources that are not currently available. The federal and state response to the current conditions is being coordinated through the mechanisms that exist for agricultural disaster declarations and drought response, and the coverage of the affected area under USDA secretarial disaster designations and presidential emergency declarations is being expanded as the documentation of the condition's severity accumulates. But the disaster response framework, as noted in the context of the crop insurance discussion, was designed for acute events of limited duration rather than for the kind of persistent multi-year conditions that the current situation is producing. The framework provides relief for the immediate consequences, but does not address the structural vulnerabilities that produce those consequences, and the conversations within the agricultural policy community about whether the current situation warrants a more fundamental reconsideration of the federal support structure for agriculture in the Great Plains are beginning to reflect the specific framing that the current conditions are producing, not whether the current drought is bad, but whether the conditions that produced the Dust Bowl, which policymakers of that era recognized after the fact as requiring a structural response rather than simply event-by-event relief, are returning in a form that will again require a structural response. The soil conservation programs that emerged from the 1930s experience, particularly the Soil Conservation Service that became the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Agricultural Conservation Program that has evolved into the modern conservation compliance programs, were precisely this kind of structural response. They were built on the recognition that the practices that had been degrading the Great Plains soils were not simply bad practices that could be corrected by individual farmer choice, but were the product of economic incentives and agricultural market structures that rewarded short-term production over long-term soil health, and that the federal government had a role in restructuring those incentives to align individual farming decisions with the broader public interest in maintaining the agricultural productive capacity of the nation. The current situation is generating discussions about whether the current iteration of those conservation programs, which have been modified and adjusted over the decades since the 1930s, remains adequate for the conditions that the Great Plains is experiencing in the current climate context. The specific question is whether the conservation practices that were designed and implemented in the mid-20th century, when the climate of the Great Plains was somewhat different in its variability. Characteristics from the current climate are calibrated to protect the soils under the conditions of more persistent and more severe drought that the climate science is projecting for the region in the coming decades. The agronomist who pulled over on the Oklahoma Panhandle Highway and let the ash-colored soil float through her fingers has been driving the same stretch of road all her professional life, and she has been thinking about the comparison with the 1930s since she drove away from that field margin. She has been to the Natural Resources Conservation Service with her observations. She has talked to the farmers along her route about what they are seeing in their fields and what their plans are for the fields that have no crop standing and no immediate prospect of one. She has been in contact with her colleagues at land-grant universities across the southern Great Plains who are doing the soil sampling and the field assessments that will document the current conditions in the scientific record that the next generation of researchers and policymakers will use to understand this period.